Americas, all the Americas.
Yeah.
So just a quick review of a PBS timeline that was we had access to through the curriculum. As many of us remember, in the 1500s, 1565 to be exact, the Spanish settled in St. Augustine, Florida. And then New Mexico was also settled by the Spanish, and that was around 1598. Both of these before Jamestown, which we always think of as the first, settlement in the United States, which it wasn't. But that was in
And way before
1607.
Mayflower.
And before, what was that, 1621? And then in 1691, Texas is made a separate Spanish province. And these are, again, just highlights. There's a lot more to this timeline. Spanish, in 1776, the Spanish celebrated the founding of San Francisco. And that's another year that's, we celebrate as our independence, declaring our independence. But, just in the East Coast colonies, we're not thinking
I
about.
didn't know that. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I didn't either until looking at this. And then eventually, whether by force, invitation sometimes, because Texas,
Yeah.
the land that we know as Texas was, the Anglos had been invited by Mexico initially to come and settle there. That
That's a mistake.
we know how that turned out.
They were trying to protect themselves from the Apaches and the Comanche.
So who whether by force, invitation, manifest destiny, Anglo-Americans claimed for the US those territories that were once claimed by the Spanish and or Mexico, once Mexico declared its independence from Spain. So in many places in the Southwest and in Texas, people didn't cross the border crossed them. I love that. Come on in. Come on. We just are getting started. Julio, Angeles. There's coffee. You want coffee? No, okay, all right. Thank you so much.
So he's making his rounds.
Yeah, we're all gonna hug you.
So congratulations to Julio, who just graduated from Wheaton College. Yay. We're all extremely proud of you. Yeah, why'd you come sit next to your mom?
Aw.
So even though he graduated from college, we're still telling him what to do.
Yeah, well, don't you tell you, my kids are in their 30s. I tell them
yeah.
what to do. They do what they want. But.
Yeah. Still have suggestions, but-
So we're just talking the Sacred Ground. Did you do Sacred Ground?
I heard something.
Okay.
For Robert and Miguel.
So we really want, when we start the discussion, to hear your perspectives on this. So we're doing a timeline, a short timeline going back to when this Spain came to the United States. So in St. Augustine, Florida. And so we had just gotten to we're in the early 1800s. And so and I think that, and you'll like this. So in a lot of the places in the southern part of the what is now the United States, and especially in Texas and the Southwest, people of Spanish and indigenous and mixed Spanish and indigenous races had lived there for a long, long time. And then we come in and we move the border, and then they're still treated, these people who had always lived there, their families had been there for a really long time, as foreigners in this, their own land. And so in 1836, the defenders of the Alamo are defeated by Mexico's Santa Anna, with everyone dying, over almost 200 people. But then later, in another battle that same year, Mexico's military is defeated handily, and Texas is then annexed by the US. But this leads to further conflict with Mexico, and there's a war. And that ends with Mexico surrendering in 1848, and the US then acquires about that same time, 1848, additional land from Mexico in what is now the Southwest. So like New Mexico, Arizona. And in the next 60 years, we start seeing these independence movements, from Spain, and that's happening in the Caribbean and in Mexico and other parts of Latin America. But at that same time, you still have this, manifest destiny. Anglos are moving south, they're moving west, and they're basically claiming land from indigenous and Spanish American residents. Then as World War I arrives in the early part of the 20th century, we need temporary workers. And so we start, encouraging workers from Mexico to come and work in the jobs that the people who've left, primarily men who've left to fight the war, we need to fill those jobs to make the economy keep going. So these workers are encouraged to come. At the same time, though, the Selective Service Act obligates Mexican immigrants in the United States to register for the draft, even though technically they're not legal for that, but the need is there. So they're forced to register to fight for a country they can't even be a citizen in, which is it's just what we've always done. We've always responded to the economic needs of our time. When it's convenient, we invite people. When we start being fearful and think of scarcity, we're like, okay, you got to go, and we deport
Push 'em
people.
back over.
Yep. And it's just this push and pull forever. And then right after the war, the US starts setting, for the first time, limits on immigration into the United States. And so think about that too, because a lot of people always say, oh, my family did it the right way. We
Right.
came the right way. Well, that changes all the time. And so there is no right way. And so the Border Patrol is formed, and the US starts to deport Mexicans who are living in the US. World War II comes then. Okay, what happens? We need workers again. We need, people to fight for us. So we start, recruiting and welcoming people back. World War II ends. We start deporting undocumented immigrants back. And they called it, this is a horrible name, Operation Wetback. And we deported, the US deported 3.4 million people between 1954 and 1958. But then a decade later, we have in the 1960s, the civil rights movement, and that included organizing such as like the United Farm Workers and the Great Boycott, which Latinos in the US had, they raised their voices and they became, a powerful voice, and we saw a change because of that. And again, this is abbreviated. There's a lot of stuff going on there, a lot of important people. But I'm just trying to pick out some highlights. And in 1986, the Reagan administration, they granted amnesty to nearly 3 million immigrants in the US. And that was a really big deal. At the same, that same act was also trying to curb immigration at the border. But this was a part of this plan. And then starting in the mid 1990s, we started to see an increase in border crossings again, and it's continued to increase, and especially started increasing around 2014 during the Obama administration. And we know, we hear it in the news all the time. It continues to be an issue, and a very divisive one that dehumanizes those people who are coming from south of our border. And the US has yet to find a humane way to handle the current crisis, the past crisis of multitudes of people seeking asylum in our country, a crisis that the U.S. had a hand in creating because of our policies and actions in those countries from where people are coming. Migrants arrive at our border, fleeing poverty, crime, authoritarianism, and persecution, and we've either forced them to stay in overcrowded and often dangerous shelters or camps in Mexico, and we've detained them here in the U.S., often in overcrowded, inhumane conditions. And I think I just read yesterday about a little girl who died in detention while her family was waiting for deportation in Harlingen, Texas, which is where my mother is from. According to the 2020 census, 18.9, so almost 19% of people in the U.S. identify as Hispanic or Latino. Now that's an understatement.
Can you give me that
undercount.
statement? Can you say that again?
Yeah, almost 19% of the people in the U.S. identify as Hispanic or Latino, according to the 2020 census.
Okay.
Well, one thing we know about the 20.
Totally unreported, underreported, yeah.
Absolutely. And how do people see themselves? You know, and there was an article in here that we're not going to talk about, but that addresses how Latinos, who identifies as Latino or Hispanic. It's very much an undercount, but it's a growing number of people who are selecting this. But according to the census, that's 62.1 million people, and it is a fast-growing population. And then from the National Institute of Justice, referencing 2 studies about hate crimes, harassments, threats, and other types of victimization among the Latino populations, I'm going to quote them. The researchers' data suggests that anti-immigrant sentiment is a substantial driver of Latino victimization and has increased in recent years. According to the research team, this is from last year, a key policy implication of their findings is the importance of finding new ways to decrease those negative sentiments within the general population. The research findings also challenge a common perception of a monolithic Latino presence in the United States, and that the studies documented considerable variation in bias victimization across Latino populations based on immigration status and English language proficiency. So that shouldn't be a surprise to us. But okay, that is my timeline, and I'm going to turn it
You
over
covered
to
all of it.
my friend and
Cohort.
yes, Beth.
I just thought I'd add a couple of things. Some of the complication of this immigration is all the drugs that are coming in. And that really complicates it and turns a lot of people against the influx of people coming in, because they know that drugs are coming in with the rest of the crowds. So that is very upsetting to a lot of people. So I just thought I'd throw it in. I'm not even going to cover it other than mention it because it is a big factor in reaction to people coming in illegally. Meaning without that due process. Also, I'm going to really read what I just gave you about moving beyond the black-white binary. I never, a lot of these things I never even thought about until we started reading about them. We're all worried about that black and white, but it covers so much. There isn't just black and white. There is Juan Oliver wrote a book a number of years ago called Right Fields, the Promise and Challenge of Latino Ministry. And he starts out with the chapter that we read, who was Latino. And he is a church leader. He writes, a group of church leaders gather around the coffee pot during a break at a national church conference. We all knew each other well. And soon we were bantering and joking, and I said something about being Latino. And someone said, oh, sure, Juan, you're not really Latino. I pointed to my white skin and began an unusual explanation about Latinos, including the whole gamut of skin coloration. no, he stopped me. I mean, you're not Latino. Your parents went to college and you have a doctorate.
Oh my God.
Wow.
So isn't that interesting that many of us think Latino is a negative term? He says in here, though, he says that by Latino, it's meant a stereotypical immigrant of recent years. He says that we are, and then he talks about being Hispanic. And he said, we are not Hispanos, we are Latinos. I read elsewhere, and you let us know about this. Because I've been working very closely with a young woman who is from Mexico, but she's Mexican. And I asked her if she doesn't mind me calling her Latino, because I read elsewhere that, you know, that's, you gotta check to see what people want to be called. Do they want to be called Latino? And I can understand it, because you're Peruvian, you're Venezuelan, you're Brazilian, you're Caribbean, you're African. There's so many different countries involved, and then all of that is all mixed up. So
And how
What-
about mestizo?
Yeah.
Well, mestizo,
Yeah, mestizo comes from the Spaniard, like the Spanish
Right,
caste
yes.
system,
mhm.
which
It is
is,
in Spanish, a Spanish term,
yeah, to
but-
mean mixed,
mixed, it means
mixed race.
that,
yeah, mixed race,
Uh-huh.
and it generally refers to the, I think, white male indigenous woman, like mixed, mixtured, because the caste system was not just whether you were white, black, or indigenous. It also mattered whether the man was like their race and then the woman's race, and the caste system went up to, I think, 22 different categorizations.
Wow.
my, my first year Spanish textbook when I was in 7th grade, it's a very long time ago. It was the new textbook in California that year for Spanish speaking class, for teaching Spanish in class. And the second lesson was one that included a whole series of terms to use about these various careful grades that the Spaniards had made. But the thing that has impressed me is that in the English-speaking domination that moved from the East Coast across the continent of the United States, we pushed the Indians onto reservations, and what few of them have mixed into the families, it was hidden and suppressed. But I think it's partly because the populations were much larger in down towards Central America, because the land can support more people. As you move into the subtropics and the tropics, there are more indigenous people living, moving around, mixing in with all the populations, and actually knowing something about their own heritage as they mix in with the population.
Yeah, well, that's, you know, the Negromonte, where St. Mark's has, you know, gone, and we have our companion parish there. A lot of the people are indigenous and aren't, you know, they haven't mixed with people of Spanish descent. Some have, but most are full indigenous Zapoteco people, and they speak the Zapoteco language.
Oh, yes, one of the problems in our big border war is that there's nobody that speaks Mayan. And
Interpreters.
the Mayans are such an old civilization that different groups don't even understand each other that have descendants of Mayan language.
So complicated, very complicated.
Okay, let me
Yeah.
continue here. Because this is what we're doing. We have to discuss, we're all trying to figure it out. Moving beyond the black-white binary, the black-white binary keeps Latino voices out of public discourse and erases important stories from our history, and it's time to move on. Black Lives Matters mobilizations in the US include brown bodies marching, brown bodies protesting, and brown bodies bearing witness. This solidarity makes sense, especially as Blacks and Latinos in the US also have a shared past. From the mid-1800s through the 1820s, and mobs in the West and Southwest murdered thousands of Mexicans, many of whom were hung from the same trees as African Americans. And today, Latinos often live in the same neighborhoods as Black people. Like Ramsey Orta, the 24-year-old Puerto Rican man who filmed the chokehold arrest that resulted in the death of his friend, Eric Garner. Many who identify as Latinos see firsthand and identify with the epidemic of police violence that disproportionately beats, bruises, and kills Black bodies. And yet, at a national level, the black-white binary, the widespread idea that race relations in the United States involve only these two groups, reduces the country's 55 million Latinos to non-entities, left out of national conversations about anything except immigration and the frenzied pursuit of the Hispanic vote. Little national attention is paid to police shootings of unarmed Latinos, even though police in the US kill Latinos at a higher rate than they kill whites. And the tallies are growing. Many in the nation rightfully mourn the loss of Michael Brown, Freddie Gray, Tamir Rice, and Eric Garner, but have never heard of Alex Nieto, a 28-year-old security guard killed by police while leading in a park in the rapidly gentrifying San Francisco neighborhood where he grew up. The problem of unacknowledged police violence and the deaths of brown bodies is only the most immediate and violent effect of the black-white binary. Latino lives do not register in most of the nation's majority institutions, including the media, which systemically erase Latinos from both Saturday Night Live and the Sunday political shows. Philanthropic entities, which allocate 1% of their collective giving to Latino organizations, and major literary prizes can't seem to see Latino literary brilliance west of the Appalachians. You never know it from the news media, which consistently equate Latino with immigrant. Even though most people call Latinos are US born. By focusing on Latinos only in the context of immigration, the media reinforces the deeply held notion that Latinos are foreign and hostile. I write a lot about immigration, partly because of my immigrant family, but also because editors operating within the black-white binary won't pay me to write about anything else. The possibility that we might have something important to say about race, climate change, war, or class conflict remains just that, a possibility. But frustration is beginning to turn into action. The tireless efforts of Refugio and Elvira Nieto, Alex Nieto's parents, are one example. After a mostly white suburban jury found 4 officers not guilty of using excessive force when they shot the unarmed young man 59 times, the Nietos led a crowded vigil protesting their son's murder and the twisted class and racial dynamics unleashed by Silicon Valley-led gentrification. By the way, this is being written by Robert Lovato. You see his name at the beginning of this. At the core of these digitized dynamics is the necessity and erasure of Latino history, which enables gentrification and national amnesia, even in the massive part of the United States that once was Mexico. During the war in El Salvador, I learned that it's easier for human beings to kill other human beings if they can first turn those human beings into others, if they can first take away their humanity. Growing up in pre-Silicon Valley, San Francisco, I learned a similar lesson. You can't displace an entire community without first dehumanizing and then erasing the memory of that community. Or to remember would be to acknowledge the tragedy of living in a space that's been ethnically cleansed for profit and hipster fun. But fighting the injustices of the present isn't enough. We also need to complicate our country's history. A new, more accurate historical narrative is being unearthed in the greater Southwest where most Latinos live. Scholars are studying, for example, the myth of racially neutral frontier justice, revealing that in sunny California from the gold rush into the 30s, hundreds of Latinos were lynched in violent public spectacles, chillingly similar to the lynchings of Latin African Americans in the South. Tejano scholars are confirming stories told by elders in small towns in South Texas about the Matanza, the killing of up to 5,000 Mexicans by the Texas Rangers during the 1910s. Stories of headless bodies floating in rivers and skulls found in the brush with holes in the backs of their heads. The great brown hope of this research is that Mexicans and other Latinos will no longer simply play the role of foreign bad guys at the Alamo or tropical sidekicks in the civil rights stories told on plaques along roadsides and in historical exhibits and documentaries. The stories that shape our national identity, the need to give Latinos a rightful place in our history of struggles for equality, could not be more dear, especially in the moment when Latino voters were offered this choice, a candidate who has openly supported jailing and deporting small children. Better understanding, I'm going to just skip all that because it's we know that. Better understanding and representing the Latino history of the United States not only gives more value to those lives by confirming their existence, but also reorganizes our sense of national history, race, and media, so that deaths and lives of the Alex Nietos of the world are given their appropriate weight in the national conversation. Today, on the same coastal plains that hold the mass graves of victims of the Matanza, the remains of Central American and other immigrants are being buried in new mass graves. Latinos, as well as non-Latinos who do not remember the past, are condemned to repeat it. And I might add, I was in Mexico in 1961 and actually had a car accident there, so I stayed a couple of months longer. We were in the Chichen Itza part of northern Mexico. And we were in a church, and that church, the floor of that church is being opened up, and it was lined with skulls in the floor. Skull after skull between the rafters. So
Thank
I
you.
understand about mass graves. So
This is loaded. And so we're gonna have a chance to talk about it, but let's watch this short segment from the video that this session is named after foreigners, Latinos, foreigners in their own land. Wes, can we watch the video now, please?
Sure, one second.
Thank you. I'll turn the light off. This is like almost 10 minutes of a almost hour-long video that Beth has right over there. The sound is not working. We still can't hear it. Is it possible to, I think you have to do something special with the sound to make it for, like, I think it's under the Zoom control that
Yeah, under
you
the
do
Zoom
it.
control, you can share sound, I think.
Okay. That's okay. You know, Wes, we'll just forget it. I'll just give a brief recap of that section. And I appreciate you trying because I wasn't able to make it work on my end either. So that's
Well, I
not,
just wonder if it's because I was muted.
oh, it
Want to
very
try,
well
want
could
to try
be.
it
Let me
again?
let me just try real quick and then we can move
Okay,
on.
okay,
You know, it's usually pretty easy to see them even with the lights on.
okay, I'll leave the lights on.
I mean, we watch
Unless
videos
you need
here
the
all the time.
exercise.
Always nice to exercise.
Wishes his own well-being.
Yep, it's working.
Okay.
Now we can't see it. though.
Yeah,
The ease with which
we don't see the video though.
Anglo-Americans was for many
You need to share your screen.
of Anglo superiority.
Wes, you
I got it.
Had
I
been
got it.
conquered by
I know, I'm doing it.
superior people. Democracy had won out over feudalism and
Vallejo took the fight to keep his land all the way to the Supreme Court.
California.
But in 1864, to pay his court costs, Vallejo was forced to sell the last of his 65,000 acres at Rancho Petaluma to a San Francisco banker.
Mexican Americans were seen as a conquered people. Even the elites could not stand in any position of authority over the Anglo newcomers.
The language now spoken in this country, the laws that govern us, the faces we encounter, are those of the masters of the land, antagonistic to our interests and our rights. But what does that matter to the conqueror? He wishes his own well-being, not ours.
The ease with which Anglos were able to conquer Mexicans was, for many Anglo observers, proof of Anglo superiority. An inferior people had been conquered by a superior people. Democracy had won out over feudalism and backwardness. Progress was in the hands of the Americans, and Latinos were destined to extinction.
There's a sense of the inevitability of white supremacy. It's very much like the thinking towards Native Americans, that they will eventually wither away because they can't sustain themselves with the presence of Anglo-American culture.
San Diego estaba muy pobre, porque no había quien sembrase ni hiciese nada. Yo estaba muy triste por la toma del país por los americanos. Estaba encalaverada por la cosa de los americanos.
Cheated out of her land by an American colonel, Apolinaria Lorenzana, the orphan girl who had devoted her life to the missions, could not hold on to her hard-earned wealth.
Después de haber trabajado tantos años y de haber tenido bienes, me encuentro en la mayor pobreza, viviendo del favor de Dios y de quien me da un bocado de comer.
No.
In 1878, the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad steamed across the American plains into the U.S. territory of New Mexico. Settled in 1598, New Mexico was the largest and oldest Spanish settlement in the Southwest, and where the culture of Latinos remained strong.
The institutions of the society were deep in New Mexico. There was a deeply rooted insistence on maintaining the Spanish language, Spanish cultural traditions, Spanish religious traditions.
In the 30 years since the end of the Mexican-American War, the Hispano elite in New Mexico had preserved much of its economic and political standing, even as Californios and Tejanos had been overwhelmed by American expansion.
New Mexico is, in a sense, spared the violence of Texas and of California because it's a desert. I mean, there's basically nothing there that these new settlers, these incoming Anglo settlers want.
There's so many more Mexican Americans in New Mexico than there were in California or in Texas at the dawn of the US-Mexico War. These are communities that are bigger, that are settled, that have been there longer, and that really made a difference.
There were families that were land-holding families who sent their children off to school at Harvard, in St. Louis, in the Midwest, and who came back literate in English and literate in Spanish, who took their place and had leadership positions.
Miguel Antonio Otero, a wealthy Hispano, had studied law at St. Louis University. Elected delegate to the U.S. Congress, Otero was instrumental in bringing the railroad into northern New Mexico. For Otero and the New Mexican elites, the railroad brought economic progress, connecting the territory to Kansas and Chicago. But for many Nuevo Mexicanos, it was a threat.
In other places, only gentry had land. But in New Mexico, the lands that were not privately held were held in common, and they were open. They were open to be used by whomever.
With the railroad came Anglo cattle ranchers, and with the ranchers came barbed wire that now cut through lands held in common by Nuevo Mexicanos.
There's a saying in Spanish, con el alambre vino el hambre. With barbed wire came hunger, because the lands that had been used to graze animals and to raise crops were fenced off.
When people came to realize that they were losing their lands, they fought back.
Three brothers, Pablo, Nicanor, and Juan Jose Herrera, organized a resistance movement to protect 500,000 acres of land from encroachment by cattle ranchers. They wore hoods to mask their identity and called themselves Las Gorras Blancas, the White Caps.
The Gorras Blancas may have been as large as 1,100 men. They don't hesitate to take matters into their own hand and to defend their rights with a gun.
Riding by moonlight, they tore up track, burned railroad bridges and barns, cut miles of barbed wire.
My great-grandfather had to leave his home community and move upstream to Las Vegas on the Santa Fe Trail because his lands had been expropriated by Anglo-American occupiers. And though there are no stories in the family about them resisting that, the likelihood is that they were part of the fence cutters and the barn burners.
Letters from ranchers complaining about the outrages of fence cutters in San Miguel County rained on the governor of the U.S. territory of New Mexico. Crimes were being committed, and the community as a whole has little or no protection, wrote County Clerk Miguel Antonio Otero, son of the man who brought the railroad to New Mexico. But others blamed the violence on the greed of land grabbers. When in November 1889, the Herrera brothers and 44 other so-called fence cutters were arrested, the local newspaper noted, "It will be a very difficult matter to obtain a jury who can be persuaded to punish their fellow citizens for acts, though illegal, they in their own hearts feel to be right." The charges against Las Gorras Blancas were dismissed. They disbanded in 1891. The fencing at San Miguel County stopped. But in a matter of decades, only a few thousand acres remained of the 500,000-acre Las Vegas land grant.
Every family in New Mexico has a story about, oh, we used to own a lot of land. Well, what happened to that land? Well, we don't own it anymore. Well, what happened to it? Well, we don't know. It was lost somehow.
Okay, thank you, Wes. I think we
Protect the lands of Nuevo Mexico.
Thank you. All right, so before we go in, thank you, Joyce. Before we go into just an open discussion, we we would love to hear from you, Julio and Anjos, if you'd like to add anything, to this conversation from your perspective. What it's like to be Latino, how do you identify? How do you feel? So. And you could translate, Anna speaks English really well and understands it, but I think anyone is more comfortable in their own language. And so if your mom is willing to share, she could, speak in Spanish and Julio can translate for you too. Yeah, okay, go.
I think it's like really, at least for me, it's been really hard to be Latino in the US. I just as all the piece that we read today and the excerpt of that video that we watched just now. I think it really portrays very well what it's like to be a foreigner in your own continent, to know that our people have been here for thousands of years before everyone else, and to still be treated with such contempt and disgust, and to be dehumanized to such a level just for centuries across the continent. And it's also been hard to read and get educated on all this stuff just because of how gruesome and ugly it is. But it's also been beautiful to see through history the acts of resistance that have been consistent throughout the Latino or Latin American people for centuries, and that many of the I guess what we would consider Latinos, indigenous peoples in Latin America, they don't see themselves, or here in the US, they don't see themselves as a conquered people, because they're still alive and they're still fighting for their rights, for the rights of the land. And just more Spanish speaking Latinos, not that are more disconnected from their indigenous heritages, some that aren't, some that don't have any, some that have more mixed heritages, to also see their resistances across Latin America through revolutionary movements that are continuing on today. And also just organizations here in the US that continue to advocate for more rights for Latino, especially in the Southwest, at the border. And it's also been beautiful to see all the historical unity amongst different people groups to fight for rights. And that's also been really, really amazing. And I think I'm proud to be Latino, I'm proud to be Mexican, but it's been hard, and it's also been really beautiful. And I don't want to what's it called? Yeah, I don't want to say that it's all bad, but
It's a struggle,
yeah, it's a struggle. And
you're still struggling.
yeah.
Something that we have read and experienced is very little Latino history is taught in the
Right.
schools. What did you experience?
I experienced that a lot. It was there was almost no mention of the Spanish American War, or how Mexico, how the US acquired, half of Mexican territory. That there was maybe like a paragraph on that in my whole like schooling here in the US from second grade till high school, till senior year of high school. There was nothing about that. There was nothing about the protests that happened all over the country. Just at all points in history, we didn't talk about the lynchings of over 5,000 just like Mexican and descendants of Mexicans in Texas alone. I think during that period, that wasn't even just like.
Which is hard for all of us, really, because we're deprived of knowing, in our education, we're deprived of knowing what's going on and what has happened with various people in our history.
I think it goes back to what Beth read in this article. You erase someone's history, it's part of like erasing them, and then
They
it's part of
become
the-
a non-entity.
Yeah.
Well, and 2 weeks ago, when we talked about indigenous people, I mean, a lot of this,
Same
there's
thing.
a crossover with the indigenous people. And, when on this video with the land issues, we learned, when we looked at indigenous people, that there wasn't the belief that anybody owned land.
Kind of like that New Mexico.
Right,
the
right.
common-
You don't own
common
the land. The land is for all of us. And then then the Europeans come in with this land ownership concept.
It's English property rights from one end, and then it was the Hispanic ones from the other.
Right.
Yeah, and out in New Mexico, the land grants were leading to war, not very long ago in my life. But I was living in New Mexico for 20 some years.
Yeah.
Reyes Tijerina was active.
Yeah, there was just, yesterday I had the radio on and it was WBEZ Public Radio. And they had an article about, the headline is Latino history is US history, high school textbooks neglected. And it's documented, evidence that it's not there. And so, you were right. And the thing is that, because I'm going to brag about Julio, he was an excellent student. And you taught yourself a lot, like by reading and stuff. So I think, and maybe if you could share a little bit about your experience in college, because you got involved with organizations to kind of help this neglected area of just sharing, being together, uniting, but also informing people. Would you mind talking about that?
I mean, I came in to Wheaton College fall of 2019. I knew there was a Latino community at Wheaton. I didn't know how big it was, but I wanted to be part of it. And as many of you may know, Wheaton College has a mandatory chapel service that you need to attend 3 times a week. And my fall semester of 2019, Unidad Cristiana, pretty much the Latino students led organization that helps advocate and make events, like host events and stuff for Latino students at Wheaton, had the opportunity to host its first ever chapel service where they chose the worship, like the worship band, what songs were going to be sung, the speaker, and they themselves got to be up on the stage and give some of their testimonies.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it was amazing. It was a very beautiful service, and one of the things they talked about is that othering of Latinos, how we're portrayed oftentimes as like the bad guys, like the bad sidekicks,
The black
like,
hats.
yeah, the, gangsters, gardeners, yard workers, all this stuff, construction workers. And we were more than that, and that we had dignity and respect, and that we helped build this country, and that we are, part of this country, and that we're not others. And then a racist post was made online ridiculing that message
From Wheaton College, from.
from Wheaton College
Wow.
students. And then the Wheaton College administration kept it under wraps. They didn't want it to get too much publicity. They also didn't want the students to really know what was going on. Meanwhile, so Wheaton College tried to like silence and undermine the message of Unidad and Latino students at Wheaton by just a lot of the actions that they took, and really trying to keep it under wraps, especially because one of those people that was involved was part of a very prevalent and powerful like Wheaton family. That was on the board of trustees and stuff like that. So
Changes things.
and from that moment on, I just kind of felt pretty other, just as a lot of the other Unidad members did. And it just kind of felt like anytime I was just walking around, it just kind of felt like the white students were more like vigilant around me, like as if like I was going to explode, as if I was like a ticking time bomb. That's just kind of what I felt like.
Did that change at all over the years, the 4 years you were there?
With COVID, it was kind of a lot of the people that experienced those moments graduated by the time COVID restrictions had lifted to the point where things could happen. Like by my junior year, things like most people had already forgotten it, or they had graduated already. Being the only Latino in the math major math department was it was pretty isolating too, but we got through it. But it's also there's just so much to say just about Wheaton and how much of the workings of Wheaton are still working under a very colonizer mentality.
Is that just like conservative Christianity? Is it?
I think it's organizations
Uh,
that are, I mean, I think Wheaton is an example because it's a conservative Christian organization.
yeah,
But I think organizations in general are try to protect their own.
yeah.
So
Yeah,
what Julio experienced with the board of trustee members thing, I think that's kind of behavior of
Corporate
like,
sin.
Yes,
like, right.
Yeah.
Like, how can we keep what's ours? How can we, if it's a profit organization, how can we increase our profits? How can, if it's a nonprofit organization, how can we keep the support that we have and how can we not change too? I think I like Wheaton is very resistant to any.
I never noticed that.
After 40 years of being there, you didn't notice it? I mean, it's very resistant to change, but I think a lot of organizations are.
Oh,
I think organizations take
nature
on
of
a
it.
personality and they want to protect
their
theirs.
image and their.
Yes, I mean, working at College of DuPage, I saw these same kinds of things happen at a large secular community college. I mean, it's just, it's,
At the same time, Wheaton is evangelical and they're supposed to reach out and convert. So that I think that would include converting Roman Catholics, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
well, yeah,
Changing.
I don't know.
things, yeah.
I don't know about that.
A lot of
My experience at Wheaton was attending a class they had I was invited to join it and to audit a class they had on Old Testament that Rabbi Stephen Bob
Mhm.
taught with a
Yeah.
Old Testament
Right.
scholar. And it was interesting to be there. The students were lovely to me. It was nice to go over there. I was using a cane at the time, and people would open doors for me. And
That tracks.
I was allowed to be there and listen and hear the talk. They were being taught how to talk to Jews.
Yeah, that's a proselytizing approach.
Yeah.
Okay,
You
so
want to share and then Lindsay.
I don't know if anyone knows me. My name's Fuad Sarai. I've been here for a while. This
The
was my
library,
project.
yes.
you're big.
So I have a couple of comments to make. First, with respect to Wheaton College, I agree that large organizations have a degree of inertia. And it's not easy to turn them around. My metaphor is hanging a U-turn on the Titanic, right? So it's not easy to do that. But I also think there's the feature of evangelical Christian organizations having been infiltrated by white nationalism. I think for longer than we know, but obviously we've known a lot more about it since they came out from the bushes during the Trump years, and of course it's still an issue. So I think it's not just conservative Christianity, it's the marriage of that and evangelicalism and white nationalism, and not just for the Latinos, but also for any other minority or racial group that is becoming more and more of a problem. The other comment I have is that, awareness is one thing, but awareness alone doesn't help. Awareness has to trigger actions to make changes, to improve the situation of minorities or ethnic groups and so on. Whatever has happened to African Americans and Latinos in the United States is not unique, not by any stretch. Okay, so this happened all over the world. For example, if you look at the history of the Belgian colonial administration over the Congo, what used to be called Belgian Congo, horrible stuff. If you look at the current conflict between Israelis and the Palestinians who are subject to a cruel and illegal occupation, same thing. If you look at some of the things that happened in East Asia, the Japanese, for example, in Manchuria before World War II, same thing. Of course, in Latin America, the same thing. Again, whenever you have colonial or imperial organizations, the British in India. So the reason I bring these up is that, or South Africa, right? The Republic of South Africa. The reason I bring these up is that we are not alone, right? These phenomena have existed and continue to exist in many other countries. And rather than sit here and say, oh, what can we do and think it's only up to us, there's a whole world of experiences by ethnic, racial, and religious minorities who, to some extent, have come out of these situations and reasserted themselves, for example, in South Africa. And we can learn from those experiences. So rather than look at it as, oh, it's the United States only, I think we need to really widen our vision, broaden our vision, and see, this worked here, this worked there, this worked here. How much of that can we port over and apply in the United States instead of thinking just African Americans or Latinos or I don't know, Asian Americans or anything like that, Each of those groups has its own set of problems and challenges, but to put it in a bigger picture, I think gives us access to more information and more tools rather than just looking at the USA only. I don't know to what extent that happens, I don't think it happens enough.
No, it doesn't. And it's kind of a next step. I mean, but for so many of us,
Yeah.
hearing some of these things within our own history, having, taken mandatory US history classes, multiple, not just once, but, in junior high school, and what we learn even in elementary school, and the gaps
Oh,
that have
sure.
been there. It is kind of this like,
Yeah.
almost an assault, like,
Oh, sure.
what you thought was real wasn't real. And
Yeah.
it's a total relearning. But I do think that is a really good next step once we make sure we all understand that we haven't learned the
Sure,
truth. But yeah, and I would love to hear more.
Well, I'll give you two
About-
examples. For example, the young children who went to colonial schools in what was then the Belgian Congo, Africans, would be taught that Belgium is their motherland. Okay, in Lebanon, where I grew up, there were several lycées, French schools,
Mhm.
right? And in the morning, they would sing an anthem, right?
Mhm.
Only it wasn't the Lebanese anthem, it was the Marseillaise.
Yeah.
And these people
Your
pretend that they
culture
were
is
somehow they were
completely
French, and they thought
eliminated.
that because they were French, they were superior to other people, which was absurd. But these things, even in the last, 50 years, were still
Yeah.
happening. So, there's lots of situations like this
Mhm.
where people have come out of the shadow of imperialism, colonialism, racism, and so on, where we can learn from those situations.
Yeah. Before,
Oh, no,
Lindsay was trying.
Joyce can go ahead.
Okay.
I just want to say that Wes probably
Oh,
needs to
yeah.
leave because he
Yeah.
has to get ready for the next service, and so
I do. Thank you so much.
we can continue to talk,
All
but
right, bye,
basically,
everybody.
Bye, Wes.
Thank
we're on
you.
borrowed time
Thank
now.